out. We're happy to see you again this year for the History Department, one of our new Black History Month events. My name is Melissa Cooper. I'm an assistant professor of history here at Rutgers-Newark. I'm the author of Making Gullah, a history of Sapelo Islanders, race, and the American imagination. A contributor to Race in Retail, Consumption Behind the Color Line, the author of the Instructor's Resource Manual for the textbook, Freedom on My Mind, A History of African Americans with Documents. You may have run into some discussion about my work, anywhere from blogs to podcasts, etc., etc. So I am very happy tonight to be here inviting in conversation with some very phenomenal sister colleagues about the work that we do. But I will say that when I first visualized this sort of what would this program look like last year, it was so wonderful to know that my Rutgers-Newark community and family was actually going to make sure that I could bring that vision to life. So this event surely was made possible through the support of the Federated History Department here at Rutgers-Newark, the Office of the Chancellor, the Dean's Office in the School of Arts and Science, Department of African American and African Studies, Program in Women and Gender Studies, the Joseph C. Cornwell Center for Metropolitan Studies, graduate program in American Studies here at Rutgers-Newark, the Graduate School at Rutgers-Newark, and the History Club, and the Clement A. Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience. We also should deliver some special thanks to Sandra Draper and Daisy Riviera. This is staff from Gourmet Dining. They're providing the wonderful refreshments that we have here this evening for our reception. Sonam Shah and the fabulous staff of the Robeson Campus Center who made sure that this room is perfect for tonight's event. And Justine Hunter, our wonderful videographer. So, because Justine is going to do such an amazing job, I am going to invite you to disable all of your videotaping and trust that we will make available to the public the actual professional, perfect recording from tonight's event. So that's where we'll start. Of course, no event here at Rutgers-Newark would probably happen, especially in the History Department and Department of African American Studies, without the tireless labor and wonderful, brilliant genius of Christina Strasburger. She's just amazing. She puts everything together. We're always so grateful to have her there to help us execute a variety of visions. So, this evening, last year, for those of you who came, how many people were here for, okay, very wonderful. Look, we have some return folks, and happy to see all of the new faces. Our program last year was largely inspired by this book, Telling Histories, Black Women Historians in the Ivory Tower, a collection of essays edited by Deborah Gray White. And I was so happy that she was able to join us last year. So she was part of our panel. Our inaugural meeting involved a conversation with the historian who thought it was important and necessary work to make sure that we have these conversations so we understand the experiences of Black women in the Ivory Tower. So, continuing in that spirit, we are having this conversation again, and I'm so happy to welcome to Rutgers-Newark Dr. Daina Ramey Berry. She is the Oliver H. Bradley Regents Professor of History and the Associate Dean of Graduate Education at the University of Texas at Austin. She completed her BA, her MA, and her PhD in African American Studies and U.S. History at UCLA. She's the award-winning author and editor of 5 books and several scholarly articles, a list which includes Swing the Sickle for the Harvest is Ripe, Gender and Slavery in Antebellum, Georgia, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from the Womb to the Grave. Her recent book, The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, has been awarded 3 book awards. She's also a gifted teacher and has received teaching awards from every university where she's taught. Dr. Berry has appeared on several syndicated radio and television shows. She served as a historical consultant and technical advisor for the remake of Roots by Alex Haley. This is for A&E. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the Huffington Post. Professor Berry is currently finishing a co-authored book, A Black Women's History of the United States, and she is creating an online resource on slavery for K-12 educators and working with the Enlight Productions on a digital media platform for women's history called Making History Hers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. We are also so happy to have with us Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens. I could probably call her Dr. Deirdre Cousin Cooper Owens, literally. She's an associate professor of history at Queens College, CUNY in Queens, New York, and an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. She's won a number of prestigious honors that range from the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Postdoctoral Fellowship in the Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies, to serving as an American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology Fellow in Washington, D.C. Dr. Cooper Owens earned her PhD from UCLA in history, and she wrote an award-winning dissertation. A popular public speaker, she's published essays, book chapters, and blog pieces on a number of issues that concern the African American experience. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won the 2018 Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. Professor Cooper Owens is also the director of the program in African American history at the Library Company of Philadelphia, the country's oldest cultural institution, founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731. She is working on her second book project that examines mental illness during the era of the United States slavery, and is also writing a popular biography of Harriet Tubman that examines her through the lens of disability. In the fall 2019, Professor Cooper Owens will join the Department of History at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, where she will serve as the inaugural Charles and Linda Wilson Professor in the History of Medicine, and will serve as the director of the Humanities in Medicine program. She will be the only African American woman heading a health humanities program. Wow.
I have not seen my aunt and my cousin since I was in my early 20s from Jersey City. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.
Welcome. That's Rutgers North. Beautiful things happen. Dr. Sasha Turner, thank you so much for joining us, is the author of a multiple award-winning book, Contested Bodies, Pregnancy, Child-Rearing, and Slavery in Jamaica, which won the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Award for Best Book, that deals substantially with the history of women, gender, and or sexuality. The Julia Cherry Spruill Book Prize from the Southern Association of Women Historians, an honorable mention for the Maduro McLeod Book Prize in Latin American and Caribbean section of the Southern Historical Association. Her book examines the struggles for control over biological reproduction and how central childbearing was to the organization of plantation work, the care of slaves, and the development of their culture. Dr. Turner completed a PhD at Cambridge University and is Associate Professor of History at Winnipeg University, where she teaches courses on the Caribbean and the African diaspora, women, piracy, colonialism, and slavery. Her research on gender, race, and the body, and women, children, and emotions has been published in a Journal of Women's History, Slavery and Abolition, and Caribbean Studies, and has been supported by Rutgers University Race, Ethnicity, and Gender Studies Fellowship, Washington University in St. Louis African and African American Studies Fellowship, and the Richard Civil War Era Center and Africana Research Center Fellowship at Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Turner recently completed a fellowship at Yale University's Gilbert Lerman Center for the study of slavery, resistance, and abolition, where she worked on her new book project tentatively titled Slavery, Emotions, and Gender. Her essay from this project, The Nameless and Forgotten Maternal Grief, Sacred Protection, and the Archive of Slavery, was published in Slavery and Abolition, and has won several awards, including the Maria Stewart Journal Archive Prize from the African American Intellectual History Society, the Letitia Wood Brown Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, Southern Association of Women Historians, and an honorable mention from the Judith R. Walkowitz Article Prize for Gender, Sexuality, and British Culture from the North American Conference of British Studies, the Kimberly Handler Article Prize for the Latin American and Caribbean section of the Southern Historical Association. Please join me in welcoming all of our excitement, my excitement at least, about the conversation that we are about to have. I probably should have told you all, I'm working on a couple of books. One is a book that will examine perceptions of Black suffering and the activities of the Society for the Preservation of Spirituals, and a follow-up sequel to a book that Dr. Berry co-edited with Dr. Harris, Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, will be The Legacy of Slavery in Savannah. I'll be co-editing with Dr. Talitha LaFloria. So things going on all the time. I think I'm going to start someplace that's a little bit different from the place I originally planned to start. I thought it might be good for us to go back to the beginning. How you found yourself looking in the mirror and saying, I am a historian, or I am going to be a historian. What was the spark? Tell us about that moment, that experience, or that precipitating event.
So I had three.
Okay.
3 moments. But I'll make it brief. The first one, when I was 6, I was called the N-word for the first time, and by our neighborhood bully. And my mother took me up to their house and very professionally sort of laid out to parents about the way they raised their child. And it was my first witness of an African American history lesson in like 30 seconds, or maybe it was 2 minutes. So that was something there that was a very memorable space, and to have her talk about the greatness of Black people to this family of white folks that lived on our street. So that was my first sort of exposure. The second one was another negative experience in college when I was at UCLA. There was a visiting professor there who happened to be white, who happened to be from the South, who was teaching an African American history class, and he was using the N-word once again every single day in class. He was using examples that were very offensive, and the class was predominantly African American. And so instead of answering the questions on the midterm, I wrote him a letter and told him I was offended by the way he taught the class, and that Black people don't just sit around and talk about basketball, which is what he assumed we did. When you're at your dinner table talking about basketball, all these things. And so I ended up having to go to detention. I call it detention, and we spoke every Wednesday for about 2 hours. It was mandated that I had to go see him. But it was in those conversations that I realized and learned that history is about interpretation. And that if I wanted people to interpret in a way that looked familiar to me, then I needed to become a historian myself. And so that happened right before I met my dissertation advisor, who came to UCLA that final year, a Black woman, Brenda Stevenson. I took a class on slavery and I was like, this is what I want to do. And I called my parents. I was a semester away from graduating with an econ degree. And I said, I want to be a historian.
You were saved.
Yes, I want to be a historian. So I took another year and got my degree in history, and then went to graduate school, and it's been ever since.
So happy. A good intervention.
So for me, it was really quite serendipitous. I was one of those students who actually hated history. And it wasn't until my second year in undergraduate at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, where I'm from, that I started to develop a love. I wouldn't say I loved history in second year. And it really sort of developed into an interest in history from reading Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery. And I read Capitalism and Slavery, and I often say in almost like romance-style novel, because of the ways in which Williams was challenging a lot of what I understood about Caribbean history, and in particular the history of abolition of slavery and the slave trade. One of the reasons I had disliked history for much of growing up was that history was very much an extension of British imperial history. So we sort of know or might be familiar with the history of the Caribbean. And this was relatively recently, and there has been a long history of more recent anti-colonial historians who pushed back against that imperialist narrative, but that sort of hung over until the 1990s when I was in high school doing history. And so for me, history was just another subject to be taken because we were required to take it. But when I got to second year and I sort of read Eric Williams, it really challenged a lot of what I understood and disliked about Caribbean history. And then I started to ask questions. So I didn't understand at the time all of what Eric Williams had written. But by beginning to ask questions of my undergraduate professors, who were very accommodating, I started to become a little bit more curious about why is it that you could sort of have one interpretation of history that we all grew up with, and then here I was suddenly being confronted with a very different interpretation. And that interpretation, the piece that sort of stood out to me was growing up and sort of understanding the ways in which the British sort of saved the Africans and people of African descent. And part of that narrative was sort of the heroic struggle of British abolitionists in, selflessly ending the slave trade and slavery. So it was very much a history of benevolence, of humanitarianism, that they were very self-sacrificing. So I grew up with the names like William Wilberforce, which most of us are familiar with, celebrating him as a hero, and Williams really did not. He really challenged that idea of the humanitarianism of abolitionism and really centered on economic arguments. And again, I didn't understand fully all of what he wrote, but through ongoing conversations with my professors, I sort of got to understand a bit more about Williams sort of shifted away from humanitarianism to the kind of economic determinist argument for the abolition of slavery and the slave trade. And even at that moment, I still hadn't decided I would have been a historian. I sort of said, okay, I'm going to stay a history major. My intention was to transfer into the law program. And I sort of just stayed with it because I was curious. It was more my curiosity about history that sort of sent me down the rabbit hole of completing the degree in history and sort of going on to do my master's.
That's a great question to ask because I came to the study of professional history much later in life. I was 30 when I started my PhD program. Also having Brenda Stevenson, Daina Ramey Berry's advisor was mine. But I realized I had the good fortune of being born in the early 70s, so it was a quote-unquote Black Power movement, and also having the good fortune of growing up literally until I was 30 in all Black communities. So I'm from South Carolina, but also grew up in Washington, D.C. And so even the places that my family sent me were these all Black enclaves, Jersey City every summer as a child in elementary school, junior high, South Carolina's Low Country. And so in those moments, I literally was surrounded by, enveloped in Black history. And so at the very earliest memories, my grandfather we would sit on the porch because they were old school and they had an air conditioning, so you had to sit on the porch at night. And he would literally tell us these ghost stories, but they always involved, back then we said slaves. They didn't say enslaved, so they would always involve slaves. And I was like, this is interesting. And then my mother is still, the family historian. She's the genealogist, the person who has traced our family back to the same county in South Carolina to the colonial era. And so she was always telling me these stories, and then going to a Black elementary school and having teachers who were invested in us. And so I was, we were taught the Negro National Anthem. We were always, every Black History Month given, those trivia contests, and I would always win. And so I went to two HBCUs, Bennett College for undergrad and Clark Atlanta University, and always had a deep desire, but had never really studied history professionally. And so the moment I kind of knew that I would be a historian, I was at Clark Atlanta, and I was literally in a space where Black history wasn't just about trivia. It wasn't just about the first person to invent a thing or do something that was extraordinary, but recognizing that the kind of common experience of Black people made Black history. And so I thought, I can do this. I can really do this. And because I had come to it a little later in life, I had a string of low-wage earning jobs. So I was like, what? I can actually get paid to read and write for a living? Like, really? Okay, I can do this. And so I applied to PhD programs and miraculously got in, and once again, they paid me. And so my classmates were always complaining about things, but here I was, my last job was at a self-storage unit as Sephora, and I literally had the opportunity to read about, not just the greatness of Black people, but the ordinariness, the fragility, the strength, all of those kinds of things. And I remember I always used this joke about good times. It was an encyclopedia hustle with Michael, and he was trying to explain it to his father. I know Black people must have done great things in the world. And I was like, Black people have done great things in the world, and now I can be the person to help produce that knowledge, right? And so that was really the moment for me, being a student at Clark Atlanta University in the 1990s, early 2000s, that pushed me towards the study of history.
I love that you ended with being the person who is constructing knowledge, right? I think about my own pathway to the professoriate or to life as a historian. Anyone in my family would tell you that I was taking a camcorder in every elderly person down South's face as early as I could and say, tell me the story, Grandma. Where did you live? And tell me about your family. Like, I wanted to understand the past. Because I started to understand as I grew older that it was such an important pathway to the present. And much like you, Dr. Cooper Owens, my path, to graduate school was a little bit different. It wasn't necessarily traditional. I spent many years teaching in a high school, teaching history first, and I absolutely loved it. But there became a moment where I realized that I needed to be a part of the production of history, right? That it was great for my students. It was a wonderful thing. I believe that you leave things while you love it. Teachers should not stay in the classroom past the point where they are unhappy. But definitely, I felt like I needed to do more, right? That I needed to be a part of the production of it. So this year, I curated this group of wonderful sister scholars, especially thinking about Black women who write histories about slavery. So I think the next place I'd like us to go in the conversation is, so let's think about what kind of challenges have you encountered trying to construct, write the histories, make the knowledge about slavery in the archive or in any other sort of facet of the work that we do.
We're not always given access, and if we are granted access to archives, we have to look very, very hard to find Black women. They're there, but you have to dig through, read documents over and over again, It might just be a passing word that says wench, and they're actually talking about a black woman. And so we find them in offensive spaces, in violent spaces. We find them in descriptions where terrible things are happening to them in their bodies. We find them not cataloged. They're not in the card catalogs. They're not in the finding aids. They're not in the descriptive inventories. So it's our job to unearth them, find them, and tell their stories. And I think that's one of the challenges. And then also balancing out as a writer, how you write that kind of history, or how you and preserve your own self-care, because sometimes what we're working with is very difficult history. And to be able to come out and go to dinner with your family or go teach a class, you're sometimes not really in the space. If you spent the whole day reading about a brutal beating or something, or writing about that, it's hard to then come out and say, hi, how are you doing everybody right now? A lot of times you don't feel that, and you have to be true to yourself. So those are some of the challenges I would bring up.
Definitely.
Yeah, I would definitely sort of agree that being in the archives is really one of the most significant challenges that we face in terms of trying to find something that's not there. It's beyond searching for the needle in the haystack. The work that I do around pregnancy, for example, I'm sort of interested in understanding the customs that enslaved people adopted and practiced in terms of trying to secure the health of their children, in trying to secure their own maternal health. And the enslavers were not necessarily very interested in those details about women's lives. And even those very intimate moment, the moment of giving birth, that was sort of a moment that was largely hidden from the view of the enslaver. And so you don't sort of have a wealth of knowledge sort of being written within the archive that you can sort of just go to and find it. And so you really do have to go to those phrases and sort of follow through with that phrase. But I think the other piece of it that you've hinted on, Dr. Berry, is the kind of emotional labor that comes into doing this kind of work. And I think that might be the most challenging thing for me. In doing the work for my book, Contested Bodies, I didn't sort of realize just how emotionally taxing that was. And it was, I didn't realize it because I wasn't necessarily writing about the most obvious kinds of violence. I wasn't writing about the brutal whippings and the violence that we're sort of expected to see. What I was writing about were cases where women died in childbirth from apparent natural causes. And so the recording of death is really very different. The recording of death for children was also very different. And so when you sort of look through the ledgers, it's simply the child's name or the mother's name and child. So for example, it would be Mariah's child dead. There's no report of a cause of death. But the issue is that when you spend 10 years with those records and you add up over 10 years being immersed in that kind of a work, but also looking at the reality, which is that more than half the enslaved children died within the first 9 days. So there's a phrase in my book that talks about dead before the 9th day, which is a real thing. A lot of children died before the 9th day, and then another quarter died by the time they got to age 2. So going through that record of death was really quite taxing in terms of emotional labor on the historian. But I didn't realize it until towards the latter end of the process that I sort of have this dark cloud that really just hovered over me, and I just couldn't understand why I had this deep sense of depression. And then eventually when I think this might have been 2014, and this was the beginning moments of a series of protests around the killing of young Black children. And I started doing some work around Black maternal grief. And there were a few essays that I read, and somehow being able to sort of read within the discussion around Black maternal grief and how Black mothers were responding to the deaths of their children, that then gave me insight into the experiences that I was having. that I had sort of become numb. I allowed myself to become numb to what I was reading in the archive, when suddenly here I was being confronted with it in the context of the present. I now sort of understood what was happening in the archive. And so, indeed there is a challenge of finding the material, but it's also the challenge of having to endure that pain without even realizing that you are going through such a painful experience.
So it is an archive question, but it's also for me, especially at this point in my career, a kind of practice, or what is my method to doing history. And so I'll start with that one first. I recognize, in terms of the way that I do history, I have to bring my own experience into it. And as historians, we're not taught to do that. And we are generally not taught to do that because of this fiction that objectivity somehow protects us from bringing in our own experiences. But I told you, I always trusted the people that I lived around, that I've been taught by. And so I had to trust that bringing my own experience would help me read the sources different in the archives. Because I just didn't believe everything that I read, because I knew that my ancestors, quite honestly, were not the ones collecting that information and putting it in the archives. And so I often give this example when I do my book talks. So most people think my book is about James Marion Sims. It is not. It's about the enslaved women, and it's also about the men who helped to develop this branch of medicine. And so growing up in this really small town in South Carolina, there were a few light-skinned folk. My joke is always, I thought I was light-skinned until I was in college. I'm serious. And they were like, girl, stop. Like, we get you down there. So I really, there's not a whole lot of light-skinned folk. And so the very few light-skinned families were always connected to the rich elite white families. And so my mother and my father used to work at the National Archives in DC, so I took a trip down. We're in the archives, and my mother just, can I come? Maybe I'll help you find, all right, fine. So we're doing this together, and then I look at this census. Every other person who had written about James Marion Sims had only been interested in looking at the census in terms of his wealth. How many slaves did he own or lease? I'm looking at it centering Black women. And so I started to look at the census. Now, census can't tell you much, especially about enslaved folk. You don't get names, you don't get a lot, but it tells you age, sex, race. So I saw N, Negro. I saw an M. One M out of 17 leased or owned slaves. That mulatto child was the youngest child that was born on the plantation during the experimental trials. And so what I brought with me was the experience of living in a place where I knew, right, that elite white folk had sexual relationships with enslaved folk all the time. And so I just had a hunch, well, let me look at the racial classification of slaves, which might not seem, the kind of the thing that one does, because aren't slaves supposed to be Black, right? But I recognized that in 1850, there were different racial classifications for Black. A mulatto was one of them. And so that's me bringing this experience, right, of being in this place into the archives with me. The other thing is, and I say this as someone who directs a program at the Library Company of Philadelphia, and I'm constantly, gently trying to teach some of the archivists because they believe the archives is a politically neutral space. And I have to tell them, no, every time a Black person, a woman person, a poor person, a Native person, right, a disabled person enters into the archives, it is always as a pathological object, a deviant, a criminal. And so you don't find archives generally of, Sambo and Kizzy walking the dog. Like just doing, going to buy a loaf of bread. They don't enter the archives in that way. So they enter it as objects that are meant to be sold. They enter it because Sambo died through, by hanging or drowning, or there's some kind of slave auction. And so when people collect that kind of data, right, the archives is fundamentally flawed when it comes to people who are not property, who are not white, who are not male, who are not of a certain age. And so I now am in the position to be able to teach the people who I work with, those fellows who are coming in with these really myopic and narrow ideas, you know, that you have to distrust the archives in the same way that folk told you to distrust your own experiences in doing that kind of history. And so the wonderful thing is I am now able to, as someone who produces history, right, to be able to just pivot it so I can say, let's just think about this history including all the actors, not just one. So my book is not just about Black women. I look at all the women who were involved. But that's the thing, in centralizing Black women, it changes the narrative, it changes the interpretation, and it completes a much fuller history, because the history of gynecology, right, in the age of slavery can't just be about the doctors or the disease. The patients have to be able to play a part in this. The laborers, the nurses have to be able to play a part in it. And so I think the very wonderful thing about having a panel of folk who look like us, who are trained by people who look like us, is that we now recognize Black people aren't just flat objects, right? That they're full-bodied, three-dimensional folk. And it is our responsibility to be able to share what we've seen and what we've read and what we know about the past in accessible ways.
Deirdre, I'm going to let you always go last because you do such a wonderful and natural job of like leading me to the next place where I wanted us to go with your testimony. Yeah, we're just having all this kinfolk undercover communication. I mean, this idea of bringing yourself and your experience to the work, to the research, is something that was so powerful in my pursuit of history, right? Like, everyone thought they knew everything there was to know about the Gullah. All the anthropologists had said everything that they needed to say. The studies had been conducted. It was, the conclusions had been drawn. Everyone knew what they needed to know. And it was my grandmother and her voice and the day that I will always remember. And the anthropologist was leaving Sackville. I was just visiting for the summer, coming down from New Jersey, from the big city. She looked at me, we were playing on the beach with her kids, and she said, "Little girl, never forget what you have here. Always hold on to your people and your Gullah roots, and, just don't ever let it go." Got back to Grandma's house. I'm like, "Grandma, what's Gullah?" She said, "That's some bleep white people made up to sell books." And then all of a sudden, right, the experience that I kept having with people in the Low Country as family members was totally different. The way they understood themselves, their history, their culture, their identity, what they were grappling with, right, was totally different from what researchers saw when they came and imagined these quaint scenes and crafty people and cute dialect and beautiful baskets. There was another story. And I knew the story because I brought my experiences to the archive and to this process of trying to find and uncover history. So definitely my first book project was totally rooted and connected in what I brought from my own experience. So your first book project, was this a product in part of your own experience? Most people say, oh, histories are in some ways autobiographical. What inspired the book that you wound up publishing first?
Which was a comparative study of slavery, family, community, and labor in Georgia. And that's where my father's family was from. And so we had gone there when I was 10. We lived in Atlanta for the year. And we spent time in the fields of my great uncle. And I remember I wanted to stay in the cotton fields. I just wanted to stay out there. I was raised in California, so I hadn't seen cotton before. And so I was just running up and down the fields and looking at it, just wanting to be outside. And so I wanted to study the history of enslaved people that worked in the cotton fields. And so I did a comparative study of slavery, family, community in Georgia. And but what I ended up writing about was about women and gender, and about how women's work and their labor in the fields had not been really considered skilled labor. So I looked at a way that how do we define women's work as skilled when they're being singled out, they're being selected, they're being written about in journals because of the way that they do a particular craft, and they do it better than anybody else. And so I'm saying that women cotton ginners were skilled laborers. And there was a journal that I found, and it had all these numbers in it. It was 81 pages, and I kept trying to make sense of it. I knew that there was something there about enslaved women, but I couldn't find them. And so one night I laid them all out across the floor, every single page, just row after row, and I got on my knees and I was crawling through, reading over the pages over and over again, and I finally found it. I found these 4 women, every like 5 or 6 pages, and I hadn't seen them before, that were reserved for ginning the cotton, which was cleaning the cotton. And they were reserved for that, and they ginned about 20 or 30 pounds more per day than anybody else. And I thought, that is skilled labor. There's something about them, they're priced higher. People like the quality of the cotton that they're giving clean cotton over. And so that was something that I found. And I also found pregnancy and childbirth. So the same 4 women, one gave birth to twins, then a few weeks later the twins passed away. And so I was able to read that journal of the story of these women ginning cotton, but they were invisible before, but I just kept trying to look for where are the women in this history.
It has so much to do with sort of where we're located.
Exactly.
For sure.
So for me, I often get the question, well, what are your sources? How did you find sources to talk about pregnancy beyond just the number of children women gave birth to, the number of children that died? And I say, well, it's the same sources that all historians who worked on the 18th and 19th century Jamaica, the same sources that they've been using. The difference, to sort of echo my colleague's point, is I sort of brought my full experiences, my full understanding and cultural background of Jamaica to the sources. And it wasn't conscious at first, but as I sort of went through the process, I realized that that's what I was doing, that I was sort of able to see things in the sources. I was able to construct narrative in the sources because I grew up in Jamaica. And I could give you sort of one example of that. Throughout the records, I kept seeing references to baths. So these are special baths that the women would perform on pregnant women, on children. And these are ritual baths that had a variety of herbs added to them that were done by various spiritual leaders within the community. And automatically that became a point for me to zero in on, because growing up in Jamaica, that was something that we did. That in addition to, if you have a headache or a bellyache, you go and you have some tea. Well, the other part of it is that, whenever you're ill, there is a particular bath that you would have, to attend to it. And so my ability to be able to find and sort of construct an entire narrative about how enslaved women cared for their pregnant bodies and their children was very much coming out of that cultural context where there were references and there were stories that you grew up with, that you sort of saw it, sort of almost magically emerge from the archive. And so to really talk about the issue of historians not being objective, that's such a fallacy. Because even in, the traditional histories, they're also bringing their own experiences to bear on their own subjects. But part of the challenge is that as, Black historians, Black women historians, we have to be smarter. We have to be more circumspect. We're held to a very different standard than other historians are held to. And I think part of, having this kind of discussion is to push back against those kinds of requirements, where others in the field are not necessarily held to those standards.
I will answer the question, but it is funny that often you will get these questions about the way that we do history. And I have to remind sometimes the questioners, I'm like, so I wasn't born enslaved, right? I was born in the 1970s, not the 1850s. Because there's almost a sense like, and I was like, so I'm doing the same historical practice as you, but you're not asking someone this who looks like you. So those are some of the things that you do have to deal with. But in terms of coming to the first project, I am a frustrated journalist. In the 90s, I went to Oprah, like every other little Black girl. So I went to college. Literally, I went to college wanting to major in journalism and broadcast journalism. I had won a lot of speech contests in South Carolina, and people would always tell me, that girl can talk. So I was like, okay, I'll be the next Oprah. And then I realized I didn't like journalism, and so I kind of didn't know what I wanted to do or be until I got the Master's in African American Studies and went to UCLA. And so I remember knowing I definitely wanted to write about Black women. And I wanted to write about Black women in the 19th century, but I'm like enslaved, free, I'm not sure. And then by year 2, my advisor was like, so, and she's very popular, she's like, so, Deirdre, I don't mind giving you a subject. And I was like, okay, I have to find it. So I was also heavily involved in my Bennett College alumni chapter. And Janetta Cole at the time was the president of Bennett, and she was going to be in conversation with Reverend James Lawson, the civil rights icon. And because I like to talk, the Bennett College chapter said, you need to moderate. So Janetta Cole and Beverly Guy Sheffield, one of the architects of Black womanism, co-wrote a book called Gender Talk. And like any good moderator and host, I read the book. 2 to 3 sentences emerged that literally changed my life. There were these 2 sentences that talked about this man, James Marion Sims, the father of American gynecology and experimental work on enslaved women. And I didn't know anything about this. And here I was with a master's degree from my HBCU in African American Studies. I'd gone to an all-Black women's college. I had no clue. I only knew about Tuskegee. And this is before Henrietta Lacks. This is before Rebecca Scoots' book. So I called my mother, who has a degree in professional biology. So I'm like, Mother. And I say I'm a Black person who says mother. So I said, Mother. I was like, had you ever heard of the slave experiment and gynecology? And she's like, no, just Tuskegee. And I knew at that moment I had a really great dissertation project. And then as I started to peel back the layers, when Sims leaves the South and goes to New York, he's working on poor immigrant women. And it was an Irish. And he's literally doing the same thing that he had learned on enslaved women's bodies on the Irish. And I was like, okay, I got it now. I made a comparative dissertation, that people might be interested in, because all human beings have a medical experience. We've all been born, right? And so for me, it was always, how do I make this legible to people in the 21st century? How can they see themselves in this older history? And so I was always very conscious of, writing a history that would be accessible to people who exist outside of universities and colleges. And so that always was something too that led me to write in a way. I mean, I had to write for 10 years. I got bills. But beyond that, I also had to write in a way.
Sorry, Doctor. We're always have to do this hashtag BW. Writing Black Histories.
No, it's true.
Feel free to tweet.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
you're like, that's a takeaway.
No,
I got bills.
I do. I have bills. And so I also wanted to write a book that, just like my dissertation, was easily accessible. And so that was also something I had always, and I try to do this now, write in a way that's not jargon-filled. I can do that at conferences. But for my writing, I want everybody to be able to understand it. And so it was just, I think, journalism, moderating, talking a lot, understanding the significance of this particular history for all people, even though it deals with gynecology, really, converged for me that the history of medicine was something that was really important, and it needed to have more people who looked like me involved in that field, in that process.
See, now you all have me thinking. These are not the questions that I have on my list, but I have to ask. I mean, so you're each describing sort of challenging the conventions of the types of stories that were told about slavery. So professionally, I mean, I've thought about the risk involved in the first research project I did. I'm taking on every academic discipline who had ever figured this out, and then all of the scholars who had unconsciously and uncritically used this material, and I thought a lot about risk. So I hear that it's coming out a little bit. Are there risks associated, professional risk with the type of challenging that you're doing in your work? And I also am thinking about risk in terms of narratives and audiences. I was like, I'm going to write an intellectual and cultural history and it's going to be for every single person to read. And that was my mission, because I felt like it could be done. But then we have to ask ourselves questions. What do we lose? Is this a pop press, to go with the academic? What are the risks that we take when we try to speak to certain audiences and when we challenge certain stories? I figured I'd just be the exorcist and pull it all the way out. Let's talk about that.
There's always lots of risks. Primarily, I think one of the first risks is that we're using the exact same sources that have always been used, the same sources that our colleagues have been reading and quoting, and we're using those sources right in their face and saying, I got this from the same books that you read, from the same journals, from the same narratives, from the same archives. You just did not see the people that I was looking for. So when they come up to you after you present, oh, I want to know where you got that source, or where did you get this? And I'm like, it's right here in the journal, it's right under your eyes. So when the first book argued about enslaved women being skilled, I was using the words of enslavers who were talking about the skills of enslaved women. It was historians of the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s who refused to look at black women as being viable laborers with skilled labor. So it was really a challenge against historians, and I had no problems doing it because I was using primary documents. So I had, as they say now, the young folks say receipts. I had my receipts. I was able to do that. And then with my recent book, The Price for the Pound of Flesh, that was really a study of looking at how we have all this stuff on slavery and capitalism, but nobody looked at how enslaved people thought about themselves as marketable goods and human beings, and how they pushed back against being treated as commodities. Nobody wrote and asked questions about what does it feel like to stand on the auction block and gaze at your audience. Those stories were written from the audience gazing at them. And so I'm like, flip this around, and how do we talk about enslaved people that are sitting here looking at people, looking at buying them and trying to analyze how healthy they'll be or how much work they're going to perform. How are they sitting in that moment, and how do they survive that moment? And then we come up with ways to think about it and come up with theories and ideas based on thinking about and asking different questions of the same sources that we've always used. And that's what's the beauty of history, and that's how I came into the profession. So I don't mind taking risks, and especially after tenure, I could care less. I was a little cautious before, but not so much, because I had to be bold enough to go against a field of historians who ignored enslaved women. And I think having Deborah Gray White's model and telling histories, and having Deborah Gray White's book, Aren't I a Woman?, to show that enslaved women were here, and to have work like by Betty Wood and Barbara Bush, the people that wrote about Caribbean women, Hilary Beckles. So having the scholarship in the 1970s support the work that we were doing in the 90s in graduate school was a way that, you cannot touch somebody, as one of my mentors told me early on, they cannot touch you as long as your name is in print. So publish, 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 publish. And use primary documents to make your argument. And they can't question that. So I have no problems taking risks because of that.
So I became Deborah Gray White's inaugural postdoctoral fellow, I think this was in 2009. And when I started, Deborah Gray White gave me a copy of this book, Telling Histories, which we talked about earlier. And in it, she wrote, welcome. For the rest of the year, almost every Friday, we would have a lunch get together, and we would just talk about anything. And what I've realized is that I didn't actually think about taking risks, because a lot of the huge risks were already taken for me. And I understood it as such from having read Telling Histories and from sort of being in conversation with Deborah Gray White for the year. And also to you too, Daina Ramey Berry, which is I'm sort of standing on the shoulders of Black women who have taken huge risks. And so at this moment, I'm not sort of thinking first and foremost in terms of taking risks, because you've laid the foundation for us, and you've made it possible for us to be able to tell the stories that we're telling. It doesn't mean that the work that I'm doing now is risk-free. So I spoke about the abolitionists earlier, and it only occurred to me later on that I was really taking on the Dons in the field, who've written about William Wilberforce and who've written about the humanitarians. And it occurred to me when a reviewer of my book said, "Ooh, you didn't let up on Wilberforce." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he sort of said, "Well, you really gave him a hard time." And then I realized what was happening, that everyone had celebrated Wilberforce and had largely uncritically accepted the humanitarian framework of analyzing both Wilberforce, but more largely analyzing the process of ending the British slave trade. And in my sort of bringing my socialization as a historian coming out of the University of the West Indies, it was not one in which Wilberforce was being celebrated. And in fact, I sort of, have provided almost the antithesis of Wilberforce being a celebrated humanitarian, which is that he proposed, along with several others, not the immediate ending of the slave trade, but a delayed process not to protect the enslaved families, enslaved women, enslaved children, but instead to protect British financial interests, right? So it was very much a cost-benefit analysis that Wilberforce and many other parliamentary abolitionists had taken in sort of working out a very complicated plan for ending the slave trade. And so my work does sort of take on, a body of historians and a tradition. So even if you think of British national identity today, it is celebrating abolition without slavery. You'd never think that the British were the leading slave traders because they've celebrated abolition. So, so I've taken on tremendous risks, but I mean, what I'm sort of thinking through now is I never thought of it in such terms because I've had historians, Black women historians, who paved the way and who not only made it possible for me to take the risk, but I felt protected. A colleague said to me recently that, I think, we were talking about another colleague's book, and he said, "I'm going to be careful here because I don't want the Black women mafia to take me on."
We're a mafia.
We're a mafia.
So there is sort of now this very clear understanding that there is, there's a price to be paid because all of these women have already, laid the foundation for us. And so I'm standing on their shoulders, sort of being in this moment because of them.
So it's interesting. So I'm the generation kind of after. So it's funny, even though I was an older PhD student, Daina and I are like in the same age range. I'm a generation after her because you graduated before I started at UCLA. And so I didn't come into, I think, doing the project thinking about risks. The thing that was risky for me was calling myself, still, identifying as a historian of slavery, but also in many ways centering the white physicians and also Irish immigrant women. And so I thought, oh my gosh, well, how will people take this work? The other risks, this keeps following, so I'm just going to hold it. The other risks were, I think, after the process. And it was about, where do I get published? Because that has currency in academia. And so, also, I was really afraid, I think, Sasha and I are very dear friends, and so she's heard this story, she knows the struggle. I was actually really afraid to have people read my writing. And I share with you all on a personal level, I grew up in all Black spaces. And so I had always been told that I was a great writer, was a wonderful speaker, I was really smart. And all of a sudden, I go to UCLA, recruited, mind you, and that means they brought me there and paid for me. So the narrative wasn't broken for me. I was like, okay, I'm so smart, they snatched me from Clark, Atlanta. All right. And then I took a research seminar with this woman who I didn't know, because this was before the kind of popularity of smartphones. Had I been in grad school now, I would have been able to Google her. But she was notoriously elitist and racist, and another, at that time, graduate student at this Ivy League school sued her and won. And often that doesn't happen, and this was a Black woman. Now, I didn't know this. By the second quarter, it was a 2-quarter course, the first quarter, she said, this is a magnificent project, you're doing all kinds of research, she's rah-rah-rahing me on. By the second quarter, she says, you can't write. And in fact, you need to go to the lab. And I said, you don't have a writing lab or writing center for grad students. No, I mean the undergrad one.
What?
And so, exactly, that was my response. But I had to keep that on, keep it in here. Because, I was like, I can't lose this fellowship. I told y'all I worked at a self-storage unit in Sephora. So, I was like, I don't. So, for a year, I could not write. I couldn't write until my advisor, another Black woman, graduated from Yale, had been celebrated, won awards, and she said to me, you just have to put yourself out there. And she literally said, join a writing group. What? UCLA is not a Black space, and so here I was the only person doing this kind of history, and she said, join a writing group, and I did. And then 2 years after, I won the best dissertation prize at UCLA. So I was like, right? I just practiced, and that was the risk. And then I get, as I'm shopping for presses, I go with the press that's probably the least prestigious, which was UGA. And I had people, are you sure you want to go with them? I mean, they're not as prestigious. Why don't you go with UNC? You sure not Johns Hopkins? I went with little UGA press. They had a Black editor. In fact, they might be the only academic press with a Black editor. And I remember they didn't believe me. I was like, trust. Literally, seriously. I was like, trust me. I said, people will get it. I promise you. People buy the book. I'm not sure. And guess what? It was his first award when I won my award. So at the end of the day, the risk is often go with your gut, go with the person that you trust. I knew they produced good work. And I knew it was a space where I would be able to also, highlight a history that a lot of presses weren't really interested in because they wanted me to focus on the doctors or the disease. And UGA had done books on enslaved women. And I could pick up my book and not find a lot of typos, like in some of the presses people were telling me about. And the editor was really committed to me doing a really great project. And so I think for me, it wasn't necessarily the risk of doing my subject matter. It was really the risk of putting myself out there. We have to be peer reviewed. We have to have our books reviewed. That affects our tenure. It affects our promotion. So that, for me, it was just more about how do I prove to myself, how do I prove to others that doing this kind of history is worthy. And so it gives me, in a weird kind of sense, because I have always been so sensitive about my writing as a historian, as my academic writing. I've always been really sensitive about it. So it always warms me when graduate students or peers say, oh my God, I love the way that you write. Your book was so accessible. Because I had been told that I didn't know how to do that thing.
Can I add something? I don't even know which professor that was, but I was told by someone at UCLA that I didn't know how to write like thinking people write. And that I did not know how to write like thinking people write. And that I needed to present the Black view of history. And I told this professor there's not a monolithic view that all Black people don't think alike. And so I had a lot of trouble at UCLA and was forced to retake my comprehensive exams over again. I had the top grades in the program. I had a professor that told me, you will get, I understand you have all A's, but I'm going to give you a B. And so my advisor, same advisor that you had, said, go see her every week. Go see her every week in office hours. I went every single week. I would turn in my paperwork for her. I would let her read my rough drafts. And she'd give me feedback and I'd revise it. Got a B. She made sure I got a B.
Oh yeah.
So
it's a her.
Yeah, it's a her. Yeah, she had
You see why there was no amateur recording going on? We got one video recording.
That was different. She did tell me I was really smart. And so it was this assumption. She said, I understand. You probably came from the ghetto. I promise you, from an environment of struggle. like you, my family, I'm the first college graduate, and I was sitting up here like, my mother is a member of Delta Sigma Theta. But I didn't say that, right? I didn't say that. But, you know, I was like, what? I was so quiet because I had never had someone think so uncharitably of me. And that does not mean that first generation is, but I'm sitting here like, I'm giving you everything that is the best of me as a student, and yet you can't see past the trope of blackness.
Right.
And so it was interesting. She actually apologized to me after I won. I got more job offers than anybody else I graduated with and won the dissertation prize. And she comes up, I just want to say you deserved it all. Thank you very much. That's all I can say. Thank you very much.
I think it's more about perseverance than it's about risk. It's more about perseverance than it is risk. You know?
Yeah, perseverance and also what you're doing with it. Like, for audience, I'm a woman of a certain age. However, I am the baby in the crew in terms of intellectual lineage, right? You know, Deborah Gray White, a research assistant. I first met Dr. Turner. She'd already graduated PhD school and was a postdoc, and I was working for Deborah Gray White. You know, Dr. Cooper Owens was kind enough to take me under her wing. I don't think I finished my dissertation. Maybe I had just finished when I met Dr. Berry at a conference, and I was like, I read your book. Oh, can we talk for a few minutes? I mean, and so, but here we are sitting together, and it's in part because these women have made sure over the years to check in. Are you okay? How's it going? How's it coming along? How's the family? How's the research? How's the work? And that was something that I think, you know, had been modeled by the Deborah Gray White's generations on down. So that perseverance is something that I think is only possible because there is this kind of informal thing that happens each generation to the next of watching out and taking care of each other. So for all of these women here, for sure, you know, we're sitting here because at some point in my little development, you were there. So I'm very appreciative, and I'm wondering about that. Like, what do we need to do to sort of make more Black women who write Black history? And how do we sort of expand, continue, grow that, teach the perseverance that you were going to talk about?
I think it's about being deliberate and, like, without sounding cliche, each one teach one, you know? I mean, recruit, work with, support, and mentor Black women scholars. And that's something that's been a big part of my career and a focus, even scholars that are not my students. You know, I mentor a lot of people through formalized mentor programs or even through informal relationships. I think I've had conversations with all of you at different points in your careers, you know, when things come up. And I think it's just being available and sharing the stories and being supportive. And I think you have to be deliberate about that and choose to do it and mean it from the heart.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So, you know, see people, like really see them. And I keep talking about Deborah Gray White because I think she was the first Black woman historian in the U.S. who saw me. So when I did my my graduate work in the UK, and you know, I'm from Jamaica, so coming to the U.S. was coming to an entirely new world for me. Going to conferences, I was isolated. I didn't sort of have a crew. I didn't have a sorority. So I was always just a little person by myself. You know, I didn't have a crew of people to call on to just, you know, hang out. And when I got to Rutgers, Deborah Gray White said to me, "You're just there, aren't you?" And she looked at me for a couple of seconds, and she just saw through all my bravado. Like, you know, I always portray to be the person who has it all together. You know, I might be going through so much internally, but outwardly you could never tell. Deborah Gray White saw through that. She took the time to see through that. And in seeing that, she sort of held my hand, and that became a turning point for me. And so it's reaching out to others, it's seeing them, investing the time to see others, and paying it forward. So, you know, at the end of it, on the other side, I think this was 6 years later, when my book came out, And I emailed Deborah, and then I'd seen her shortly after. And I said, I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude. This would not have been possible without you. My dear friend Deirdre also knows that my dissertation was not my book, and when I first moved to the US, the project that I was working on was also not my book. So I sort of changed what eventually became my book twice. And I was only able to do that because of Deborah, and also because of having a sister scholar network to sustain you. And so when I said to Deborah, I'm just so thankful that you saw me, and I said, I have no idea how I could repay you, and she said, pay it forward.
Pay it forward,
She told
that's
me
what she
that.
tells us. She tells us all the time, pay it forward.
She said, pay it forward. And you sort of think about, the old adage, the old saying, as you climb, you lift. You bring others with you as you sort of climb. And so those are the things that I keep in mind, what has been done for me, and to also pay it forward to others.
Yeah, so my mentorship is a little different because I started to conceive of my career differently. I think every person here knows the struggles that I had at my first job, and it wasn't necessarily the university but the town. So I used to work at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, for 5 years. I know. I like when people make good with this, and I appreciate all of the response. Yes, that's how I felt, and that's how most everyone felt. When I told them that, it was really tough, really, really tough. And I was stuck. Here I was, this person that was really celebrated at UCLA, because people like to celebrate the kind of Black person who they can call exceptional. So it's like, I was the person who won the dissertation award. I was the person who got the most job offers. I had gotten teaching commendation, and then it was like my star did this and just kind of it was just static, and I couldn't move because I was really depressed. I was living in a really, really hostile, racist, anti-Black place, and I thought, oh my gosh, maybe I shouldn't be in academia. And so I was able to kind of pull myself out of that when I had the opportunity to come to Queens College. And so people were like, you're going to leave a Research One flagship institution, the low teaching load, yeah. And it made me really think very critically and strategically about the kind of career I wanted. And so once I was clear on that, I also knew I wanted to be an institution builder because I had come from an HBCU background. And so I literally put myself out there. I started to ask people to mentor me. I started to ask for advice. And so now that I'm in a place where I'm able to now model the kind of behavior and life and moral compass that I want students to see, or junior faculty members to see, I put myself in people's places. So sometimes when I see people floundering, I'll just be like, girl, what's going on? I have I'm in the history of medicine. So most of my mentees tend to be white men from really elite spaces because there just aren't a lot of Black men or women who do the history of medicine and science. And so even for these men who graduated from Princeton and Columbia and Brown and Tulane, and Penn, and they are literally, because they're now confronting this thing, I can't find a job. And they did everything right. And things typically work for them, and now it doesn't because of the state of the market in our field. And so for me, I mentor in different ways. For those elite white men, it is really, I think, an incredible lesson for them to be able to have a mentor who looks like me. And see, I told you. And so for them to be able to have a mentor who looks like me, and to be able to, when they do public interfacing work, one of them just wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, and he shouted out 2 Black women scholars, and so that never really happened before, right? And so they see from my example, you can do that, and in fact, good things will happen for you. Not necessarily bad things. So to have Black women who are like, I'm the only person in my history of science and medicine and technology program, there's nobody else like me. you know what, that's okay. Let me tell you the places where you can go, where you can be connected. And plus, girl, we got FaceTime, Zoom, Skype. You know, we can get it together. Like, don't, you know, so for me, it's about being able to have people know that, you know, the folk like us are available, that we're accessible, that we're all trying to put in the good work, but also to be decent human beings. I don't ever want to be like the person who told you and I that really horribly elitist, racist, you know, lie. I want to be a decent human being to my students so that that kind of replication of violence and intimidation and hazing people doesn't exist anymore. Because I can tell you, outside of that one bad experience, my time as a graduate student really was quite pleasant for me, because I tended to be surrounded by people who wanted the best for me. And so I think coming through that experience, I always want to model that for others. Hallelujah.
I do have questions that I wanted to ask, but, you know, I can come up with, anyone who knows me well, I can have a question a minute for the next 24 hours. It might be better if we open up for some audience questions if you have. So, if you didn't notice when they set it up on the back of your programs, hashtag BWWBH, for any of you who are tweetering, or whatever it's called, tweeting. I'm still getting all the social media. I tried. Good evening.
Hi. I'm not a historian. I have a question about research. I have traced my family history back 5 generations, and the ancestor that I'm stuck on was born in 1820. My mother's family is from Virginia. So my question is about how can I I've done this through census records. So I need to move to other primary sources, but I don't really have the time to go to Virginia. So my question is about what sources can I access without physically traveling to Virginia?
Have you used Ancestry.com?
Yes, that's where mine.
So, because you're going to probably need to get to the county record level to get more information. So if you found her in the census, you're going to need to find out last names and start setting names. I always tell my students, believe it or not, when we're looking for slaves, enslaved people, we often spend more time studying the white families who own them to get to that. So looking at their last names, seeing if there's people, if you can find out stuff about the owners' letters and papers will have information about your relatives. That's one place. Now,
I have to go to Virginia to do that.
I'm trying to help you not go to Virginia. That's why I asked about Ancestry. First Search is also another one, and also Hatha Trust, HATHI Trust, has a number of old articles, and some of that's there. A number of libraries are digitizing their collections. So the New York Public Library has a large digital collection, and they'll have stuff on Virginia. The Virginia Historical Society has a large digital collection. You can also write to archivists at the Virginia libraries to get more information at the county level, and they'll sometimes, for a small fee, send you those digitized files.
And I was just going to add, you can also join a lot of the Black genealogical groups. So, you know, I mean, that's the thing. They're always, I see somebody waving back there. So
You got a business card right
so
here.
you should connect with them. So, I mean, because like someone like my mother, I don't do genealogy, but she's like you in that. I mean, she can literally tell you, she and my father divorced, and she knows about his family to the colonial period because that's her thing. And so Black genealogical groups contain members like my mom, who it's like for them going on an expedition, right, to be able to uncover clues, land deeds, property records, find out which archives have been just, at University of Virginia. Just send in, maybe call, email an archivist there. Tell them about, that's right, and they can help you locate items.
Brenda Gunn, UVA, write to her, and Crystal,
I forget Crystal's last name.
Appia, Crystal Appia, African American
APPIH.
Archivist, APPIH. They're both at University of Virginia.
Thank you.
I forgot, Dr. Berry, you do this on TV sometimes. Finding
No,
the heavy location. That's who you think you are. Love it.
The question that I have was just based around when y'all was talking about the death rate of the babies census, I wanted to just kind of get I guess, a rounded number of male versus female babies that died during that process.
Yeah, so I don't have a complete sense of the gender breakdown of infants who died. But generally speaking, you had more female children who were born. And so you sort of have even a skewed ratio in terms of the male-female breakdown for infant death.
Yes, good evening. My name is Nashan Farad. I'm a journalist for YourBlackWorld.com, and I've actually done stories on the sexual abuse of black women during the Black Holocaust, otherwise known as slavery. What I would like to know is, briefly, in your research, can any of you please explain, we've heard of the case of Sarah Barkman, and to this day, many black women say that when they're, say, in white corporate America, they feel sexualized, often by white men. In your research, have any of you ladies been able to determine how is it that white slave masters were racist towards black people, but at the same time were raping black women?
Very hypocrites.
Yeah, I call it racial cognitive dissonance. Right, it's hypocritical, but the racial cognitive dissonance is you can see a thing and know what it is in terms of reality, but you're so wedded to your ideology, your system of beliefs, that you will literally do a different thing or write something. So perfect example, for me, I do the history of medicine and slavery. We've all heard black people don't experience pain, right? That comes out of something that's really, really old in terms of the development of history of science and medicine in the West. However, you look at the sources, and I'm not talking about what the enslaved, because enslaved people were by and large illiterate. They weren't leaving written sources. Look at what those men who owned them or who examined them wrote. They'll say, Betsy lost sense of herself and struggled violently. We had to get someone else to restrain her. Wait, you just wrote this in your medical journal article that was published in this prestigious journal. And yet you just said she lost sense of herself. And you find that kind of racial cognitive dissonance. They know, right, if they're experimenting on black women to cure white women or all women, that it has to be a lie. Because the cervix in a black woman's body is the same cervix in a white woman's body, right? It's not like you have a different ankle bone. So there's this kind of, or a clavicle or your fingernails. They know, I'm just saying, right? But they're writing these articles on the distinctiveness of everything that's supposed to be different between black and white people. And they know it's not true. And so for me, it's a racial cognitive dissonance where they just cannot separate themselves from the racist ideology, because separating themselves from the racist ideology then but it upends everything that they have built around white supremacy.
And there's so many times that you can see that mass drop, I love that Frederick Douglass, when he gave the speech in Rochester, commented talking about the prohibitions, against enslaved people learning to read. As you think about the South Carolina codes, he was real clear in stating that you don't bar people from reading who you think are so ignorant that they can't learn a thing. That you only create that type of, barrier when you know the opposite is true. So there's such a way that if you just read so much of what is left behind against the grain and interrogate it with a different set of questions, that you see that the mask was flimsy, it fell off all the time, and as Deirdre says, cognitive dissonance was everywhere.
Yeah, so I think of it in another way, which is these people were invested in rationalizing the system, which is that you sort of had theologians, you had legal theorists who were writing laws, who were actively changing laws to fit with what they wanted. So you look at the changing laws in places like Virginia, and between 1619 and 1700, and the various laws that were changed in order to prop up and support the system of slavery. And so, yes, there is sort of, the cognitive dissonance, but I also think there is a deliberateness that to make this system work, they understood that they needed to create a legal system to support it. They needed to create theories, racialized theories to support it. So these are, intellectual individuals who went through great lengths to create particular images. I think Patricia Collins called it controlling images, to paint particular images of enslaved Black people to then justify and make the system of slavery work. So they were very much theorists who knew very well what they were doing, but it was very much deliberate in an attempt to prop up and to support their system. But you sort of do have these off-the-cuff moments when you sort of get to who they are, when the mask falls off, when the intellectual mask falls off, and you sort of get to the truth of what exactly is going on in the experiences of enslavement.
I was listening to the Michael Cohen hearings today, and what you just said reminds me of his hearing, right? That's that on that. Okay, and then my first question is, I know I need a mentor. I'm not an academic, but I do like scholarship. And I'm on my 4th book. And so it's a book of poetry and commentaries. I'm a journalist by trade. My background is, I worked for NBC as a news videographer for 8 years. And like you said, you had to leave. I had to leave. So when you come to the point that you have to leave, that you realize like you're in an institution that's not going to support you or it's going to kill you, one or the other, you just got to go, right? But my question is, how do you, one, recruit a mentor? I don't know how to recruit mentors. And then my second question is, have you ever had the experience when you're writing something that you just pass out? I have that experience a lot. Like when I'm writing, I just end up like passing out. Like particularly this book I'm writing on now, which is called Loving This to Climate Change. And how climate change is not just the weather, but it's the climate that we're also living in. So as I'm writing this, I like to use historical references in my poetry, but I end up passing out. And so I just wanted to know if you experienced that as well when you're writing.
So I can answer your second question. No, I have not. I have not. But I also, it's a very regimented process for me. So I come in kind of like I'm going to do this thing and then I leave it. The first question about mentorship, you do exactly what you just did. You say what you need.
I need a mentor.
Yeah, you say what you need. And then, I'm a believer the universe will answer. So then we'll talk and we'll change towards that. All right.
I've also never had that experience, but I think one of the things that it sort of is saying is the need to check in with what's going on. And I think I shared before that I sort of compartmentalized the grief and the depression that I felt in going through, and it caught up with me much later on. So I think there might be, a message ancestors are perhaps, telling you to check in, to check in, to see what's happening. And I mean, I agree, speak what you want, and it will come to pass. On the issue of mentoring, one of the things that I've learned is to be who you are, and it will then follow. So there are folks that I've sort of seen who perform the act of networking at conferences, and it doesn't work, because what then happens is that you're performing and you're not necessarily being who you are. And so if you're able to connect with a small circle, so my circle is very small. My dear friend, her circle is really large, but that's because we're two different people, right? And so I think part of it is to tune in to yourself internally, to see who you are and trust your own truth, trust your own instinct, both in understanding what's happening and to connect very genuinely with people. And to me that makes all the difference, and sort of trying to simply expand your network just for the sake of having an expansive network.
Right. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you so much for opening this opportunity. And thank you to you, Queen, because I had a very similar question in terms of mentors. So I'm certainly open to mentorship. I'm seeking a mentor. But my question is around sexual trauma. So my focus I'm in the MSW program at Rutgers right now, but my focus is on sexual trauma with the Black woman, and I want to kind of learn and understand the history behind it. So my question is, how or where do I start? What's a good jumping off point to it? Because I really, if I'm going to work with, like I work with young women now, I really want to have a solid foundation and background working with them.
So have you read some of the history books we talked about, like Deirdre White's Aren't I a Woman?
I have not, and I just actually, I'm in a different program, but I just learned about Deirdre White like 2 days ago, which is really, that's the
And we've been
universe
talking
thing.
about her all night. So
Yeah.
that's the
Universe, right?
Yes, I think I would start with Aren't I a Woman by Deirdre White, because that would give you the foundational understanding of the enslaved woman's experience from the first book that was published on the topic in 1985, okay? And then I think most of our books and some of our mentors' books would be useful just to have that foundation. There's another one by the name of Gail Wyatt, who is at UCLA, who writes about sexuality and sexualization and sexual exploitation. And she's a psychotherapist, but she writes about enslaved women in that book as well. So those are the places I would start. And Nell Painter has a great article, Soul, Murder, and Slavery, that I think is foundational. It's about how do we put ourselves on, how do we talk about putting enslaved people on a therapist's couch and having a conversation with them. We can't really do that, but we can read their records, read medical records, read other documents that talk about that and get to it from there. And the third thing is we're all happy to mentor and to connect with people that are like the perfect person for you that's not a good fit. But also I want to say about mentoring. Mentoring is not just about what you get, because a great mentoring relationship, it goes both ways. So I learn as much from the people that I mentor as I give to them. And it's a symbiotic relationship, so it feeds off of it. So you have something to give. You all have something to give to the people that you are seeking mentoring from. You have gifts that you will give them.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yes, good evening, ladies. This was very enjoyable. And Dr. Cooper, I have a question for you. I have a friend who's a playwright. I saw her play last week. It was on eugenics. And I was wondering, in your study of medicine, did you come across through eugenics that was practiced in this country, Black women who were sterilized?
Okay, so no, I have not, because I'm dealing with the era of enslavement. Okay. So the one thing those men, what owners and doctors want to do is restore reproductive health, because literally the engine of slavery rests in the wombs of Black women. And so, this is the really uncomfortable part. There's like a bit of discomfort because Sims comes up so much, when people talk about my book. And, I just got a question from a journalist, did Sims sterilize the women? And I have to say, those women were leased. So he was under contractual obligation to repair, in his language, fix the women. Because the one thing, right, that many of these rules that Sasha Turner Bryson was talking about in terms of slavery, the condition of the child follows the status of the mother. And so you want to make sure those women stay enslaved, but you also want to make sure that they are as reproductively healthy as possible so that slavery continues. Because the African slave trade had ended in 1807. And so now slavery in the United States, for the most part, is dependent upon a domestic slave trade.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, my name is Asia Bard, and I'm a current master's history student. And I kind of had a situation a couple weeks ago where I was in a class, and I guess I was doing too much and talking a lot. I'm normally pretty quiet, but when it comes to class, I'm one of the only African American studies students. So I give my vote a lot, and I guess kind of being shut down was very uncomfortable for me. And it took me back to like being in elementary school, so kind of quiet down a little bit. So I guess my question is like, how do you find that balance, but at the same time still be yourself in the situation?
You have to push back a little bit. I know you probably that was one of your first experiences being silenced. I mean, we've probably been silenced so often that I'm like, you're not silencing me. I'm going to come back to what I want to say. And I can do it in a respectful way and do it the same way, but I can say, I think you were trying to overlook what I don't think you heard me, and I want to say it again. Or let me say it differently. or I want to, let me try this one more time, because I think you just overlooked what I said, and it's important to this conversation. So there's ways where you have to really sort of, it's not that you're going to have an argument back and forth, but you could call them out. Say, I feel like you just silenced me. Isn't this a space of academic freedom and I'm supposed to be able to express myself? So can you let me express myself? Put them, flip it, and then they'll back off, and then you can finish saying what you need to say.
Good advice.
Hi, my name is David Asako-J. I'm a student here at Rutgers University in public administration major. I kind of want to harken back to the conversation you were having about the archive, and particularly the archive not being a monolith. Most of what I understand about the way that the archive operates comes from like reading Justine Hunter and her kind of discussion of the way that we ought to understand our position in the archive and the way that it's produced. So she talks about narrative restraint and the refusal to fill the gaps because the archive will often kind of misconstrue those things. And then in the same kind of breath talks about a necessity to then contribute to the intergenerational archive in a way that performs both in and against the archive. So my question is, how do you take a step back and assess the work that you produce, the way that it enters the archive, and what the future of that work is once you kind of lose control of how it gets circulated, how it gets cited, etc.? How do you manage that? Because it kind of implicates what you will choose to do and how comfortable you will feel when you finally do get published.
Well, David, since you hear me all the time in class, I'll let everyone else.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And I don't know, you probably have read it too. Marisa Fuentes' book, Dispossessed Lives, is in the tradition of Cynthia Hartman. So that would be another really great book for you to also access if you haven't. For me, it has been a struggle, and only a struggle after the book came out. The struggle is I don't ever want to be in a position of ventriloquizing the experiences of enslaved folk. Because I recognize that, like all of us, we're dealing with archives where literally all of our information is drawn from the people who own them in some way or another, or have forcibly guided their actions in their lives. And so I've had to have many conversations with myself. Am I then participating in a kind of objectification of these women? And so what overrides that for me, and I'm sensitive to it, is this is a history, these are stories that need to be shared so that we have a fuller understanding of the past, and that I try to read between the lines. But also for historians, that's what the footnote is for. So I can always create a note that brings people's attention to my struggle, right? Because you don't get a Q&A when you're writing a book or article to be able to explain those kinds of things. So the footnote can function in ways for historians where we're able to address those real challenges.
I mean, I think that's where books like this comes in, which is that historians, in writing our monographs, we don't necessarily have the space to talk about the process. In my own book, I do to a certain degree, which is I talk about how I read the archive, the limitation of the archive, particular decisions that I've taken in reading the material in a particular way. But within a monograph, it's not always possible to have that kind of a meta-narrative of methodology, being woven right through without sort of losing the story that you're trying to tell. So I think the other part of it is writing different kinds of history. And again, I talk about telling histories, which is it becomes a reflective process, reflecting on the discipline of history itself, reflecting on the methodology of history itself. Thinking through the various platforms that we have, so this is a wonderful platform to be able to reflect on those questions. A history book is never done. There's always, the after story, there's always the afterlife of telling that story. And so I think, engaging different audiences on different platforms is a really great way to then go back and, reflect and think about why we do certain decisions that we've taken. Writing synthesis also is a great way, which is pulling together all the different histories that have been written and sort of, taking an evaluation step of where the discipline was before and, the different directions that we've gone in over a particular period of time and how historians have used the material in a variety of ways. So those are the ways, some of the ways in which, I think that we might be able to have a more open dialogue about the very process of writing history itself.
We're at a critical time. I'm going to take the last of questions from people who are already at the microphone, make an announcement so that we can enjoy all the refreshments and goodies before we have to leave.
Thank you. So I wanted to say thank you again tonight. This is definitely one of my nerdy dreams, listening to you talk. And also thank you for naming the different ways that we embody or the emotional labor that comes along with working with these archives, working to uncover and uplift the narratives of these women. But I guess my question connects to the previous question, but I wanted you all to speak a little bit more about how you negotiate your voice when uplifting the voices of enslaved women. I'm thinking especially about archives where, like you all mentioned, it might just be a name or a number of children as women or a place, and we're telling a story, but we also don't want to continue the cycle of objectifying these women or let the theory that we're trying to propose override the voice of the enslaved woman who's telling us a specific thing in their narrative. So yeah, how do you negotiate that and work with that?
So for me, with the Price for the Pound of Flesh, I actually tried to use throughout the entire book as many words from enslaved people and less from me. So I wanted the book to be told from enslaved people's perspective and not how I saw enslaved people telling me. And if I only had a few words or a few sentences, I would look at the environment. So what else can I know about this space? This was an auction that happened at noon in South Carolina on the courthouse steps. So what else do I know? What can I read about those auctions to sort of set up that scene to make it as authentic as possible? Is this usually a crowded scene? Is this a not crowded scene? Is this something that is an annual event, a weekly event, a monthly event? So if I set that up, then I feel like it's being a little bit more authentic. But if I have an enslaved person's name, I'm using it. If I have their words, I'm using it. And I'm trying to allow those stories to be front and center and let me as a writer not get in the way of that. That's how I wrote the book.
So I think for me, I've had different experiences of that, which is in the essay that I most recently wrote on slavery and emotion, that was more for me, I think, than the enslaved person. And I think that was my sort of owning the impossibility of objectivity, owning the impossibility of telling a story where I am detached from it, telling a story where the present and the historian isn't sort of very much wedded with the story of the enslaved person. But in terms of the book itself, I think, my methodology was quite similar to Dr. Berry's methodology, which is within a narrative of abolition, it's always the white abolition story that gets told. And I wanted to center not just the women, but to center an aspect of their lives, which historians don't even think it can be historicized in any event. So I think the process sort of varies based on, in that particular moment, what is the story that I want to tell, but also taking on, head on, the myth, the fallacy that objectivity is possible, because you sort of always have the present interacting with the past and the historian, leaving part of their soul on the paper in the book or the narrative that they write.
And mine very briefly, I followed a very traditional history model of how to write a book. So there's an intro, the chapters, and it was very much done in the spirit of the historical actors. But I intentionally did something that was probably very different than most of the historians I know. I inserted an autobiographical story in my afterword. I didn't know when I was writing this as a dissertation that becomes a book that I would undergo IVF twice as I was finishing it. and also recognizing that James Marion Sims helped to pioneer some of the fertility treatments in this country. And so there was no way, I could not invite myself into that space as, you know, a kind of legacy bearer of those foremothers that I had written about. And so for me, that was a very intentional moment of saying the very thing that I had always wanted to do, to put the past in conversation with, the present in conversation with the past. It just so happened that it was literally inside and on my body when I was finishing the book.
My name is Kofi Ado. I'm a social major. I'm an undergraduate student, and I'm a peace and conflicts minor. Like, I see, like, most of you are focused on books, but do you plan on being involved in films and documentaries?
Yes, yes. I've done consulting for films, working on a docuseries right now. Did work with Roots, and my husband is begging me to write a film for slavery. So that will be something that will probably take me 15 years, but something that I'm just slow. But it's something that I do want to do. I'm very committed, I think all of us are, to a public audience. A lot of the work that we do, it's not seen at the academy, at the university, is at historical societies. We work on websites for different museums. We've done consulting work behind the scenes now for a number of organizations. And it's nice to see the changes when you look at, go ahead.
Oh, do you have anything on YouTube right now?
Yeah.
Just Google
Let's go to our website. We've got lots of stuff. Yes.
You'll see a whole bunch of stuff.
And as Dr. Berry said, I mean, we're all I'm consulting on the new International African American Museum being built in Charleston, doing a project with Telfair.
Yeah.
And I never thought that I was going to wind up, in the museum building business on the side. So that's definitely one. And I'm always curating these conversations because even with my book, I always wanted to make sure that I was a facilitator of conversations that happen inside and outside the academy. So there's a lot of ways that we do that. I have created interesting, they have new formats of documentaries. Like they're hybrids, half internet, half web, half TV. So there are all sorts of new opportunities, I think, even for us to take more control over how these stories are produced in the places where they circulate. Oh, just go ahead.
Yeah, I know it might not be related to this, but are any of you on social media, the main ones like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook?
Twitter and Facebook.
I don't know how to use any of it, but I'm on all of it. I'm on Twitter. Yeah. Historian Cooper.
We're all on Twitter.
I don't know what the other names are. My son manages that. Ben, do you know my name? No. He's like, Mommy, I'm barely here.
Google search for names will give you
blogs,
all
our
that stuff.
blogs, a variety of things. So just Google our names and
It'll come up.
it
Even some things we don't want to come up, but it'll come up.
Thanks a lot.
For this opportunity and all of the knowledge that you guys dropped here. I have a question for those who are struggling with losing themselves in their writing or those dissertations that are not finished. Do you have any advice on how someone kind of gets over that, especially if they think, well, who cares about this? Who cares about what I'm writing? Who's ever going to read this? Do you have any advice for the writer that's...
Well, first of all, we've all been there. We've all been there, every single one of us. And we've even had conversations with colleagues who were there, that did the SOS call. We all got on the phone and tried to encourage her, whoever it was. So we've all been there, it's normal. It's a normal part of the process of writing a dissertation, which is a very isolating process. But one of the things that I have to do is I have to talk over myself. So you have to like shut out that voice that's saying, who cares about this? There is somebody out there that cares about your topic. There is an audience for your work, and you have to believe that. Whenever you start to doubt that, you have to push that outside of you and write for whoever you're writing for, the people that you're writing about, or the event that you're writing about, or the idea. You have to write for that. That has to be the foundation of what drives you. And if you're losing, do your SOS call, and you'll have people that will support you and check on you. Sometimes writing buddies, you guys are doing a writing group, accountability partners. You can say, I'm going to do 500 words every 2 days or every day. call each other, did you do your 500 words? Yes, I did. You know, finding ways so that you're not completely isolated.
Right, and I, you know, as someone who, the rumor was that I didn't have any problems writing a dissertation. You know, my method and my magic was doing it every day. Doing it every day, paying myself before I did anything else, doing it every day. And something happens in graduate school classes, which I think is so unhelpful to graduate students. You know, they get in the habit of executing or exhibiting brilliance by tearing apart the book that they're reading, tearing apart the book that was, without ever really engaging with the book as is. So, you know, I was looking as a graduate student to figure out, what do each of these works contribute? You know, what sort of can I gain from engaging with this work, as opposed to where are all of its problems? We can see the problems, but I think that that sort of paralyzes graduate students when they go home and it's them and the computer keyboard and the sources, and all they hear is a running tape of critique that's not helpful. So you do it every day and trust that your story, whatever you are working with, is a story that needs to be told, or else, you know, the universe will have planted sadness. That's one little sidebar. Definitely, every day, right?
Mine is very brief outside of the really good information that you got. I do remember at one point I was where you were, and I was like, who's going to read this? Because 2 books literally came out that were very similar to mine, but mine was a dissertation. So Harriet Washington's Medical Apartheid, and then Marie Jenkins Schwartz's Birthing a Slave. So I remember reading it and panicking, because I said, nobody's going to want to read this when it's a book. And my advisor very wisely said, you know how many books come out on the Civil War every year? She was like, so you know what? They would talk about Civil War dance, baseball, amputees, fashion, military strategy, right? And so she said, you know, just finish, finish a dissertation, right? So I didn't necessarily think book. I thought, let me finish this task, which is the dissertation. And even though, so I was different. I didn't write every day. I gave myself a little break. But I remember thinking, I counted all writing, even email. So I would self-edit the email that I would send to others, because I wanted to get into the practice of, is this grammatically sound and correct? How do the sentences read? So I counted everything as writing, right? Because people are reading it, so it's writing. The funny thing is, I think for each of us, here I was writing, I mean, really old school plantation slavery. It wasn't really new, but there was a little thing called Charlottesville. And all of a sudden, you had college students and activists around the nation wanting to dismantle, topple, destroy, debate these Confederate statues. And all of a sudden, I lived in New York, and there was James Marion Sims' statue. And literally overnight, I kind of moved from this person who was seen as a historian of slavery and medicine to the country's foremost historian, James Marion Sims. And so I literally had to be ready, right, to get into that role. And then all of a sudden, Me Too started to happen. And reproductive justice became this thing. And so literally people started to engage history again. Right? They came to me. And so that let me know that people were interested in the past. So you don't know what political moment you might be in 5 years from now or 7 years from now. Let's do the work. Let's do the work.
Our last question.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm interested in antebellum historical fiction. I just realized there's just not a lot of research about the ways that enslaved people sounded, their dialects. And I think most people assume if you're an enslaved person, you know, they all sounded the same, they spoke the same way. And I'm currently working on fiction with the idea that an enslaved person in Louisiana definitely sounded different, spoke differently from a person enslaved in North Carolina. Yeah. So right now I have my setting. So now I need to get the dialect, and I want to really get it right. You know, I don't want to write it in a perception. They all sound the same, and it just seems like there's not a lot of research on that, and it just feels like I really need to be listening to recordings of the way people spoke. So if you could guide me a little bit.
So the first place I would go is the Library of Congress, the Voices of the Enslaved.
Okay.
There's a collection of slave narratives that you can listen to online.
Okay.
And they're from each state. So it might be a Mississippi narrative or a Texas narrative. So you'll be able to hear the difference in dialect.
Okay.
And that's from their speaking. I would not recommend necessarily looking at slave narratives from the WPA, which were the Workers' Progress Administration narratives, which have lots of dialect, but that was, so some of it was staged, where they actually had them, if they say I was walking, they'd say put W-U-Z instead of W-A-S. If they say I was going, they'd say put I-S-E. So they actually tried to make black people sound dumb and make it sound uniform. So I would say listen to the voices of the enslaved from these narratives that are on the Library of Congress that are free. And some of them actually have songs where they're singing. And you might know more.
Oh, yeah.
There's a ton of others. Like, even some of the linguistic studies like John Baugh, Marcelina Morgan, there's a number of other scholars that do Ebonics that I would take a look at their work as well.
Right, and I think you've really gotten good advice because those instructions were literal instructions, and largely a lot of the federal writers were white writers. So there's a lot of very interesting things happening in the collection of those interviews. But I would even caution you in taking a look back into some of the early, samplers of Black folk culture, your Joel Chandler Harris's, James Coco. There were people who were doing dialect writing, attempting to reproduce the authentic voice on paper of enslaved people, but almost always this is filtered through a white gaze and through the white imagination. And so I would even, I guess some of the questions that I had at the end of research is, what are we going for when we attempt to reproduce authenticity and dialect in the first place, right? So those are some questions that you might grapple with for sure. Perhaps listening to, those FWP, the interviews that were collected, the recorded interviews would be helpful. You also have to remember those folks were really little, when they sort of left slavery. So there's a lot to think about there. But it definitely can be a sticky road, dialect piece for sure. I was supposed to ask my esteemed panel this fabulous question connecting Rutgers. Our Newark campus is going to commemorate, I guess, what is it? I don't even know what the word should be. We are dedicating a field to Frederick Douglass because it was the site of a church where Frederick Douglass actually came for a visit. So we were supposed to have a conversation about Douglass's legacy. We didn't have time. However, I can mention Douglass in some sort of way. Let us congratulate Dr. Berry, who is a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Prize and will be in New York City being honored and acknowledged. She has all sorts of awards and acknowledgments under her belt, but this is particularly special. Do you want to tell folks why this year looks so amazing?
So this is the 20th year of the awards. It's from the Gilder Lehrman Institute and the Gilder Lehrman Center at Yale University. It's for the best book on the study of slavery. And I think over the 20 years, there may have been 3 African-American scholars that have won, maybe, if I counted them correctly. But this year was the first time that all 4 finalists were women. And 3 of the 4 finalists were African-American women. And the 2 that won were African-American women. That's a huge accomplishment for this award. And it's a prestigious fellowship. So I'm just thankful to be one of the 4 finalists.
And we're so grateful. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Eat, sip, be merry, buy books. They're here. Thank you.
Yes.